thank you for being here today. I mean, I know we say that every week, but every week I feel like we genuinely mean it. Thank you for choosing to make this a part of your schedule. I know there's a lot of other things, especially on a day like today, that you could be doing, but the fact that you chose to put this as a priority means a lot. And we hope you enjoy your experience. We hope that you grow in your relationship with God and that you leave wanting to come back next week. So I also want to welcome those of you who are watching online. Wish you could have been here in person, but glad you are tuned in as well anyway. And then finally, I just want to say happy Mother's Day to all the moms in the room, especially my mom right there. If your mom is sitting next to you, I'd be very embarrassed right now. That was like the weakest applause ever. So you have the rest of the day to make it up to her, okay? So anyway, we are in the middle of a series called Lies I Learned in Church. We've covered 4 lies so far already. If you haven't been here for them, you can, of course, watch them on our YouTube channel and catch back up that way. But it's probably no surprise to any of us that when the world looks at Christians, what they see more often than not is just a judgmental attitude. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, or you're watching online and you don't consider yourself a Christian, this is probably one of the biggest reasons why. Most of our world today just has a negative view of Christianity, and it is not getting any better. If you ask most non-Christians to describe a Christian, they will probably use words like hateful and hypocritical and homophobic and all those sorts of different things. And it just seems like this perception of Christianity is just getting worse and worse all the time. And of course, it doesn't help that there's those Christians out there that picket and protest, the Westboro Baptist types with signs that God hates, fill in the blank with any sort of racial or sexual slur that you want, and when the world sees that in a group of Christians, well, then they assume that's true of all Christians, and we just keep getting a worse and worse rap all the time. But it's not like it's a new problem either. This is something that has been happening for quite a while. Gandhi is noted for saying that, hey, I like your Christ. It's just the Christians I don't really like, and there was a study done in 2016 by Barna Research Group where they asked people a series of questions, and 45% of atheists, agnostics, and the religiously unaffiliated, they're called the nuns, 45% of them strongly agreed with the statement, Christianity is extremist. 45, and that was 7 years ago. I can't imagine how much worse things have gotten since then. And there's just this perception in our world that Christians are against anyone and anything that isn't us, and we just, we're humbugs, and we don't like anything, and we just judge. We are seen as a judgmental group of people. And so in response to this perception, I'm not even going to address whether it's true or not, but in response to this perception about being judgmental, we think that the answer is, or we've started to kind of, wave this flag of do not judge, The world sees us as judgmental, and so then we think the only solution, therefore, is to just don't judge. Don't judge at all, every time, any place, anywhere. Do not judge. And we come up with this actually from the words of Jesus himself. And in his famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said this, do not judge others, and you will not be judged. This is a verse that almost everybody in the world knows, especially non-Christians. They will quote this all the time, except when they do, it's usually King James English, Judge not, lest ye be judged, like we're in some medieval thing. But, I mean, this seems pretty straightforward, right? Seems like there's not really any loopholes. Just do not judge. That's what Jesus said. And then a few decades later, his half-brother James writes a letter to Christians and basically just repeats what Jesus said. He says, don't speak evil against each other to your brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, guess what? Then you are criticizing and judging God's law. But your job is to obey the law, not to judge whether it applies to you. God alone, who gave the law, is the judge, the capital J judge. He alone has the power to save or destroy. So what right do you have? Where in the world do you think you get the power to judge your neighbor? That's James' words, and I'm not sure where the whole plagiarism law, lines up. If, your half-brother said it first and your half-brother ends up being the Son of God. I don't know, but this is basically James just saying the exact same thing Jesus said. Do not judge. You have no right to judge. And you know what? In a few scenarios, this is actually true. There are some things in life, some situations that we actually don't have any right of judging. Those of us that are Christians, we have no right to judge people who are not Christians for not acting like Christians. And I don't know, I mean, it blows my mind that we do this so often. I'll hear people say sometimes, like, oh my gosh, can you believe they said this? Oh, can you believe they drank this? Oh, can you believe they're sleeping with so-and-so? I'm like, I want to shake those of us who are Christians and be like, yes, of course I can believe that, If people aren't Christians, we're going to have different values. We're going to have different morals. We're going to have a different kind of worldview of the way things go. It is such a foolish and stupid thing for Christians to expect non-Christians to behave like Christians and then judge them when they don't. Okay? Like, we should not judge that. We should heed Jesus' advice. Do not judge. But even more than just non-Christians, even just within Christianity, there are still some things that we are so incapable and inept at judging, we should just leave them alone. We should never judge somebody else's salvation, whether they're really a Christian or not. That is such a personal, intimate decision between a person and God to say, I trust in your son, Jesus. But I hear it all the time, especially when it comes to celebrities and politicians, like, oh, well, Joe Biden can't be a Christian because... Or on the other side, Donald Trump can't be a Christian because, like, whoa, we should slow down a little bit. Now, maybe they're not good Christians. I don't know. Maybe they don't have the right fruit. But can we really tell somebody's heart? Can we make that final judgment on, yes, you are saved for all eternity or not? I don't think so. We can't even judge each other's motives and attitudes. Paul himself said, I don't even judge my own motives because sometimes I'm not really sure. There are some things that we should not ever judge. But here's my question. Is this true all the time? Is this true in every scenario? Because I think what happens sometime is we look at a verse in isolation, or we pick it out of context and we just assume this means never, ever, never judge. No matter what the circumstances, no matter what the situation is, we should just not judge. But we got to think about that a little more. I mean, number one, I think it's impossible. If you say it's always wrong to judge, do you know you're kind of making a judgment call about what's right and wrong? I mean, if you say it's wrong to look down on what somebody else is doing, well, aren't you looking down on what someone else is? I mean, it's actually impossible to not judge. And even beyond impossible, it's actually illogical. We all want there to be judgments in our world. We want our legal system to make judgments about criminals, don't we? We want our doctors to make judgments about medicines and treatment plans, don't we? We want our politicians to make better judgments about how they spend our taxes and social programs and all that stuff. Like, we want judgments, but what happens so often, and we've bought into this idea as a church that when Jesus said, do not judge, we just think, never judge, never judge, never judge. No matter what we see, no matter what's going on, never judge, never judge, never judge. And it's not that what Jesus said was a lie. It absolutely isn't. But it's our modern day interpretation of what he said that is 100% a lie. Because yes, Jesus did say these words, do not judge, but he also said some other words. What else did Jesus say? And more importantly, what did he mean when he said what he said? Jesus said, do not judge others and you will not be judged. But he goes on immediately from here to say, for you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging, assuming that we would, is the standard by which you will be judged. This is not a command to never, ever judge. This is more an instruction about how we treat one another. How much grace are we going to extend to each other when we make judgment calls? Because so often what goes around comes around. We should be careful. We should be wise in how we treat one another. Right after this, the next sentence, Jesus says, why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, hey, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye when you don't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. First, get rid of the log in your own eye. Then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Again, this is not Jesus saying don't ever judge. He's not saying don't help people out. He's not saying we should ignore completely if people have specks or troubles or things that they're going through. This is simply about don't be a hypocrite. When you try to help somebody, when you make a judgment call about something, let's not assume that we've got it all together, that we're better than them in any sort of way. Immediately after this, he says, don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. They will trample the pearls and then turn and attack you. How are you and I going to know the difference between what's holy and what's unholy if we don't make some judgment calls? You know, Jesus never once intended for the words, do not judge, to be the end all be all in every situation. In fact, he continues on in his Sermon on the Mount just a few moments later and talks about how you can identify good trees versus bad trees. And he says this, yes, just as you can identify a tree by its fruit, so you can identify or make judgment calls about people by their actions. But we never want to read verse 20. We just want to read verse 1 and just stay there and think, Jesus said, do not judge. No. That's not the case. That's a lie. To take those words from Jesus and assume it's true in all situations is not only a misinterpretation, but a misrepresentation of what Jesus said. We need to make judgments. It's part of being a responsible, mature, adult follower of Jesus. There's so many things that we need to make judgment calls about. If you're a parent and you have kids still living at home, we need to make judgment calls when it comes to our kids, you know, who their friends are, what their influences are, what they're watching on TV, what sort of music they're listening to. We need to make those judgment calls. I know when I was in high school, my mom made some judgment calls about a girl I was dating that I should have listened to, you know? I would have saved myself a lot of grounding and trouble had I listened to her judgment. We need to make judgment calls when we're dating. If you're dating right now, I think the whole dating process is all about judging. Do I have the same values as this person? Are we headed the same direction in life? Do we have the same morals? Do we handle money the same way? Are we compatible with one another? That absolutely takes judging. And some of us could probably share stories about maybe we didn't make enough judging in the dating process and now we're paying the consequence now. Maybe we've been divorced because we didn't really we thought, oh, I just shouldn't judge. No, we absolutely need to judge. We need to judge when we head to the polls. If somebody is continually taking advantage of us, I don't think Jesus would say, just close your eyes and just keep hitting me, just keep taking that. That would not be the wise thing to do. We need to abandon the lie that says never, ever judge. And instead, I think we can learn this from what Jesus said. Look beneath the surface so you can judge correctly. Judge correctly. That is the key point right there. And many times in the past, Christians have got it wrong. We could probably all share stories about times when we got it wrong or somebody wrongly judged us and how much pain was caused, how much hurt there was, how unfair it was. And so sometimes we think, well, that was so hurtful. Let's just throw the baby out with the bathwater. No. Let's not do that. Let's learn to grow past the lie. Let's learn how to do this judging thing correctly. We absolutely need to judge, but we need to learn to do it correctly. But here's the thing about judging. It is so hard. It is so complicated. Every situation is unique and complex. Every single week we do something here called a message run through on Thursdays with the whole staff and, just kind of talk through the message and is this true and is this right and how does it look? And this Thursday after going through the message, we sat for 2 hours right in these chairs and talked about, what does this mean? What does it look like? And you know what? After 2 hours, I'm not sure we were any closer to a conclusion than we were 2 hours earlier. There's not like a pat answer. I think so often in life, we want a formula to follow, right? If A happens, then always follow it up with B, but that's not how life works. That's not how relationships with one another work. And like, I can't give us a definition of do this all the time. I can't find anything in the Bible that says in all situations, go this way. Like I haven't found that. And so rather than try and give here's what to do all the time, what I want to do is I just want to look at some biblical principles to remember, some guidelines so that when we do need to make judgments, hopefully we can get it more right instead of maybe like we have in the past, more wrong. And the first one is this: never condemn people. When we make judgment calls like we need to, we should never condemn people with our judgments. And I think sometimes we have this idea that condemning and judging are synonyms. And maybe when they're done the wrong way, they are, but those two words do not mean the same thing. Judging is simply about making a call, this is right or this is wrong. Condemning, on the other hand, is about devaluing people. Condemning is about diminishing the worth of somebody else. You're not as lovable. You're not as special. You're not as meaningful or significant. And we look down on people, and we should never, ever condemn people. If we make a judgment call that condemns another human being, we've missed it. We are not judging correctly like Jesus said. We see a perfect example of this with Jesus and the woman caught in the act of adultery. Some people found her and threw her before Jesus' feet, and what she was doing was clearly sinful, right? No, make no mistake about it. It was wrong and it was bad, but Jesus looked at her, probably falling down on her knees, weeping before him. Jesus looked and said, I don't condemn you. Now go and sin no more. Don't keep doing what you're doing. It's not good. It's not beneficial, but I don't condemn you. When Jesus looked at this woman, he didn't see her as any worse than any of the other people around. He loved her just as much. When Jesus looked at this woman caught in adultery, he saw that she bore the image of our Creator just as much as any other person. We should not condemn people. The Apostle Paul writes about this idea in his letter to the Roman church. And the Roman church, Rome was kind of the hub of the world at that time, had a lot of different people with different backgrounds and life experiences or religious upbringings. And when they became Christians, because of their past, there was a lot of different ways in which they expressed their faith. Some of these Christians in Rome thought that some days were more holy than others. Some thought every day is the same. Some Christians thought, I can't eat certain foods. Other people were like, send me to the buffet. It doesn't matter, And like, there's all these different opinions. And Paul writes to them about this issue. And he says, why do you condemn another believer? Why do you look down on another believer? Remember, we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. Now, Paul was clearly writing, you can read this in Romans chapter 14 and 15. He was making some judgment calls. He talked about people with weak faith and people with strong faith. There was definitely a more mature way to approach these topics. But in all, do not condemn other people. If we condemn others, we have missed the boat. And I think this is where we tend to get it wrong so much. At least I think for me, this is true, We tend to just have such this like looking down on people attitude. And here's what I think is possible. I think we can be totally right and totally wrong at the exact same time. I think we can be totally right in our judgment and totally wrong in our approach or heart behind that judgment. And let's not do that. Let's just not do that. That is a biblical principle to follow when we make. It doesn't matter if it's with Christians, non-Christians, any situation, any behavior, something in culture. We ought to never condemn people when we make judgments. The second thing I think that we can remember kind of as a guideline is this: to judge based on principles and not preferences. So often I think we get into trouble because we make mountains out of molehills, you know? We make a major out of a minor. And I think this is exactly what Jesus was addressing when he said, look beneath the surface and judge correctly. Sometimes we can get ourselves into trouble when we make judgments if we focus so much on the superficial and unimportant things. We need to judge based on godly principles of right and wrong. In fact, in Ephesians, Paul writes this. He says, carefully determine, that's a judgment call right there, carefully determine what pleases the Lord. Take no part in the worthless deeds of evil and darkness. Instead, expose them or judge them. In our world, in our culture, God has asked us to stand up for truth. God has asked us to stand up for what is morally right and morally wrong. No, this is good according to God's standards. This is bad according to God's standards. We need to make those judgments. We need to determine those sorts of things. And, topics like marriage and sexuality and abortion, those have been hot topics for a while now. We need to make judgment calls on those. But it's deeper than that. We need to make judgment calls on other moral things that God says, issues like greed and revenge and idolatry and lying. Those are things that our world has a very twisted view of. And it's a part of our responsibility to determine, to discern what is right and what is wrong in our culture and in our world. Not based on what we like, not based on how we want it to go, but based on this is what God says is true. Even beyond just with our world, even within Christianity, there are so many things that we have to judge. We need to judge if a teaching we're hearing is true or false. We shouldn't just believe somebody because they got a microphone or because they wrote a book or because they're on the radio or something. We need to judge. So often, Paul called out false teachers. That's a judgment. We need to judge spiritual gifts and how and when to use them and the appropriateness in certain situations. We need to judge church leaders and whether they measure up to different standards we find in the Bible. We need to make judgment calls about who should receive financial help. The Christian instruction for benevolence is not just hand out money hand over fist to whoever asks, but to make some tough judgments about who needs it in what situation and where their life is and what their past is. And in a world full of relativism and half-truths, we absolutely need to make some principled judgments. But let's make sure they are godly principles. You know what? If we ever get to the point where we've judged all of God's principles correctly and we've got free time on our hands, then maybe we can worry about the other stuff. But until then, let's just stick to what God has actually spoken to, and there is a clear difference between black and white, right and wrong. We should never make judgment calls about preferences that we have or ways that we want things to go. And then the final guideline for us, I think, is the most important of them all. When we make a judgment, it needs to come from a place of love. When we make a judgment about someone or about something or a situation or an idea in culture, whatever it is, we need to check our own hearts and ask, is this really love that is motivating me or not? Jesus said that he wanted love to be the defining characteristic of his followers. When Jesus was asked what the most important commandment was, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. But before anybody could even interrupt, he said, but the second one is just like it. Maybe it's second in sequence, but just as important, just as meaningful, just as much weight. Love God, but also love others. What we do, those of us that are Christians, anything we do, but even including judging, needs to come from a place of love. And love means I'm going to do what's best for you. Not what's easy, not what causes no pain, but what is actually best for you. And here's the thing I think we miss sometimes. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is make a judgment call. We read about this happening in the Corinthian church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, you can read the whole kind of account of this, but there was a man who was engaged in some sexual sin, and worse than the actual sin, even he was proud of it. The church was kind of celebrating this sin, and he was saying it wasn't a bad idea, and he was dragging other people with him. And so when Paul writes this letter to the Corinthians, he judges not only the action, yes, you are sinning, this is wrong, but he even says, I have already passed judgment on the man. He made a judgment call about this guy. And he writes this instruction to the Corinthians. This is what they need to do. Then you must throw this man out and hand him over to Satan so that his sinful nature will be destroyed, but he himself will be saved on the day the Lord returns. That sounds harsh, doesn't it? That sounds uncomfortable. That certainly doesn't give us warm and fuzzy feelings like we think love is. But it's the reason why Paul says, do this. Hey, throw this guy out so that maybe through some of this uncomfortableness, maybe through some of this pain, maybe through loss of some fellowship for a while, maybe he can actually learn, maybe he can change his ways, maybe he'll be better off on the other side. We think love is just this nice feeling. No, sometimes love is discipline and pain and judging. Paul writes to Timothy, a younger pastor friend. He writes kind of this instruction that I think is good for us to be aware of. It says, a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but must be kind to everyone, be able to teach what's right versus what's wrong, be patient with difficult people. How are you going to know they're difficult unless we make judgment calls? Gently instruct those who oppose the truth. Why? Because perhaps God will change those people's hearts and they will learn the truth. Out of love for people, out of concern for how they live in their lives and maybe what they might experience, out of all that, be kind and patient and gentle with these judgment calls, with teaching and with truth, because hopefully Paul's prayer was he wanted to instill into Timothy, hopefully perhaps God can move in their lives and restore them and bring them to a place where they are actually better on the other side. When you and I make judgments that we need to ask ourselves, is this because I love the other person or not? Do we want to make a point or do we want to make a difference? Do we care more about being right or do we care more about the other person's well-being? Do we want to lead people to discover the life-giving truth of what God says in his instructions and walking and living that? Or do we just want to win a battle and feel superior? What does love really look like? So sometimes not only do we misunderstand what judging is, but we misunderstand what loving really is. We think loving means I'll never cause any pain. We think loving means I'll never hurt somebody. I just want to ask, is that real love? Maybe sometimes. But let's think about a couple scenarios. Is it more loving to let someone remain in addiction? Or is it more loving to have maybe a painful confrontation about the harm that this behavior is causing? Which one would be the more loving thing to do? Is it more loving to allow a friend to continue to be abused by their spouse because we don't want to come across as judgy? Or is it more loving to call the police and deal with the ramifications afterwards? What's the more loving thing to do? Is it more loving to allow a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old to make life-altering, permanent changes to their body based on how they feel in the moment? Or is it more loving to say, whoa, let's slow down. Let's talk about this. Let's think about this. What does God say about this? Let's not just follow our feelings or what's cool in culture at the moment. Wait. Before you make this change, let's talk. Let's work through it. Let's wait 12 or 15 or 87 years. What's the more loving thing to do? Are we selfishly, this is such a tough one. Are we selfishly caring more about us and what they think? Or do we actually love them enough to do what's beneficial for them? There are some situations, like I said at the beginning, there are some situations where we should not judge, but they're very limited and very few. The vast majority of the time, God has called us, asked us to stand up and make judgment calls. And when we get it right, man, it is so beneficial for us, beneficial for other people, beneficial for our world at large. But we need to remember these three things: to never condemn people, to judge godly principles over our own personal preferences, and finally, that every judgment we make, stop and ask, God, is this because I love them or not? And I'm not suggesting this is an exhaustive list of things, okay? But I think this is enough for most of us to start with. This is enough for most of us to focus on in our own relationship with God. God, this is so hard for me to get. This is hard for me to get. This is hard for me to get. As we spend time with God and ask Him to change and transform us, we will have a much better chance when we have to make a judgment call of getting that judgment call right. And so what I want to do today as we wrap up is just take a few minutes to talk to God, to sit with Him, and just kind of be honest with Him. So if you would you just pray with me? Father, this is such a tough thing to do. And I know there's probably plenty of us who we fall on either extreme. Either we're so afraid of judging that we never do it, or maybe we're just judge, and we do it wrong all the time. God, the reality is every single one of us need help with this. I understand that you have given us a responsibility in this world to be your hands and feet, to be your mouthpiece, to be salt and light. Father, we just don't want to get it wrong. We don't want to do something that would purposefully push people away from you. Father, you don't condemn us because of what Jesus has done for us. You are so loving, and there's some times where even you discipline us. Father, what we see in you, your character, your heart, your love for people, Father, I ask that you would make that our heart. Make that my heart, Father. I'm sorry for the times when I have been too afraid to make a judgment call because I was worried more about myself than another person. Father, I'm sorry for the times when I've made stupid judgment calls and hurt people in the process. God, the reality is I don't think any of us can do this even close to correctly unless you change our hearts first. And so that's what we ask, Father. Would you reveal to us more of your character and your love? Would you shape our hearts, shave off the harsh edges of our human nature? And Father, would you help us to do what Jesus said, to judge correctly? Father, give us a love for other people, a supernatural love that comes only from you for the benefit of each other. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.